Mhm.
It's so much fun to be here with you and to be talking about stories.
Yeah. Well, and I've got one for you this morning, well, actually, I guess it's afternoon for you and for
Yes,
me. I've got
for
one
both
for
of
you
us.
today, right,
Awesome.
that, I think speaks to the power of relationships and connections and remembering
Mhm,
and thinking about the lessons that we learned, and you and I very often do
mhm,
that related to our fathers.
mhm,
But when I was growing up, and some of this is sort of a reflection from Surviving Sue, one of the
mhm,
stories that I didn't tell in the book about, my mom, whose life was really complicated and created a lot of chaos for the rest of us. But I've often written that my dad was such a hero in so
mhm,
many ways,
mhm,
with my sister with disabilities, my mom, who acquired disabilities really over the course of her life because of her dysfunction, mental health, and alcoholism, and then later
mm,
her complicated parenting with my sister. But my dad, one of the things I watched him do when I was not quite 13, we had moved
mm,
back to the small town that my sister Lisa and I were actually born in,
mm,
that was the same small town that my parents were from. And I kind of knew that, but I didn't really understand all the tension around it that I
mhm,
was seeing in my parents. And I realize now, that looking back, that probably was really scary for them because
mhm,
they left their small town with a taint, a lot of
mm,
scandal
mhm,
around my sister's, complicated birth and her disabilities.
mhm,
But years later, they were moving back into their, hometown with my dad
mm,
having accomplished a little bit, and he had a certain status in his professional career. And it was a strange thing to see people from their past, my
mhm,
parents' past, come into our family life,
mm,
but they were all, new to Lisa and I. But I would see these people that had these deep relationships with my parents and a lot of
mhm,
history, a lot of backstory that I didn't really know. So I think, my early interest in people, behavior,
mhm,
relationships, what
mhm,
became my career later on. It's funny when you look back and you can see some of those meaningful moments,
mhm.
in your childhood that really may have put an imprint, on who you become.
Right.
But about, I think it was December 2022, I'd written a piece about my dad and how he was always thinking about those that were overlooked or needed
Mhm,
support.
mhm,
And one of the dear friends of his that I met had a disability, and it was my dad's friend from high school, and they called him Slats.
mhm,
And I never knew, what his actual name was. But what distinguished him is that he had his left arm in a sling. So it
mm,
was clear that there was a disability, and
mhm,
my dad was always very matter of fact about it. And so was Slats,
mm,
that's how he came into the world.
mhm,
His arm didn't develop in utero, but it didn't slow this man down at all. And so I remember, watching my dad interact with him and telling the stories,
mm,
about he and Slats. They were both
mm,
athletes.
mhm,
Slats loved baseball, but was terrified, to try out for the
mhm,
team. That level of ostracizing, in the
mm,
50s when he
mhm,
and my dad were in high school was extreme. This was, pre Americans with Disabilities Act,
mhm.
rampant kind of bigotry. My
Right.
dad told a story about some of the parents
Mm.
worried when Slats was little that what he had would be contagious,
Oh,
right?
oh, right.
And that, keeping him away,
Mhm,
from, their own children. And so just all of that, bigotry. But my dad, one of the things that I saw in him then that helped me understand his deep level of compassion for my sister and
mhm,
her developmental and intellectual disabilities. Lisa also had at the time some emerging vision problems. She's blind in one eye. And so I saw how he would kind of counterbalance some of the negativity that we would see in my
mm,
mom and how she treated, my sister. But it
Mhm.
wasn't until I met Slats that I understood the origin story.
Right.
Then I understood because I saw my dad with this man who was his, wonderful friend, and heard the stories about them playing baseball together, and they went bowling together, and they were buds, and
Mhm.
champions.
Mhm.
And
Mhm.
Slats often would get teary. Maybe he'd had a couple of cocktails too, but he would pat my dad on the back and tell me that I would never know, just what a difference, you will never know what a difference
Mhm.
your dad made in my life.
Right.
And so I think about my dad even now and the lessons that I learned about being the one. And even years
Mhm.
after, we moved away. We didn't live in their small town very long. We moved maybe a year after we were there. But my dad and Slats, stayed in touch. My dad
Mm.
loved to ridicule, this man who had a nickname, Slats, because he was long and lean. He was like a
Mm.
bottomless pit. So they were constantly arguing,
Right.
no matter where we lived, about,
Right.
Slats who could eat anything. And, it was a very loving relationship.
Mhm.
And then years later, as Slats was aging, and when you think about the time period that they came up in, like I mentioned, the lack of ADA and protection
Mhm.
around
Mhm.
discrimination, same. There was no EEOC, at the
Mhm.
time,
Mhm.
and I saw my dad intervene, more than once to kind of look out for his friend,
Mhm.
and stand up for him and about his capabilities related to jobs
Right.
and being able to make a living and have a
Mhm.
family.
Yeah.
And so, you and I talk about storytelling and the importance. I think sometimes when we rewind and look at our childhoods, there
Mhm.
are those little vignettes, those little moments that matter when you see someone you love doing something extraordinary, but also ordinary at the same time,
Right. Right.
right? Just being a good person.
Yeah. Long before there were diversity, equity, and inclusion guidelines, your dad
Right.
was inclusive and showing
Yeah.
how it didn't matter if you were different, and he was going to love you anyway. And that's
Yeah.
amazing.
Yeah.
Love that
And I
story.